Welcome to Faith Baptist Church, where faith is our first name. Faith means we believe. We believe the Bible is the Word of God, and we believe that Jesus is the answer, and we sincerely believe that there's a place here for you. Faith, it's who we are, and it's who any one of us can be in Jesus. Good evening, church family, and thank you so much for coming to church tonight, at least virtually. I hope you had a great service this morning. By the time you see this, my family and I will be in Kansas celebrating the ordination of my middle son, Joshua. And so I appreciate your prayers for him and for us as we travel back tomorrow. Hey, we decided a couple months ago that we wanted to do a project at Faith Baptist Church. We wanted to learn about the history of our church. There's something valuable about knowing who we are. You know, our past is part of our identity. That's why the Bible calls us the children of Abraham. That's why the Bible's full of stories of people, because these are our fathers in the faith of our fathers. And here at Faith Baptist Church, we have a wonderful legacy. Dr. Don Forrester and his dear wife Shirley and family, really, they put in the time and the effort. They exercised faith to come and to start this church so many years ago. And I want you to hear not only their story, but you're a part of Faith Baptist Church. This is our story. And I know that you'll enjoy it tonight. So pull up a chair, zone out the distractions, and let's enjoy learning a little bit about our story here at Faith Baptist.
Well, I very much appreciate the opportunity to be able to share a little bit about the beginnings of our church here in Fredericksburg. And it has been such a blessing to me to be a part of something that God's doing. And that's the thing we've always enjoyed about the ministry of Faith Baptist Church, is that it's a miracle of God, and it's something that literally could not have been done, without His presence and without His blessing and without His superintending. And we are so thankful for the many years that we've had to spend here with this church and congregation. And matter of fact, one of our goals, one of the things that God laid on our heart was that when we started our church, that we would spend a lifetime with one congregation and with one community. And of course, we never can dictate God's will. We don't know what God's plans are, but in those early days, we had no assurance that would be exactly the way things would work out. But that was our dream, is that we could come to a community, we could establish a church that was really founded upon biblical principles and that was interested in doing what New Testament churches ought to be doing. And then stay with that church, throughout its history, and to grow old with that congregation. And that sounded like a wonderful dream, but actually that's a lot of hard work, because and we're so thankful that has been the opportunity we've had, is to be with this church throughout our entire ministry. But that means that every stage and every change, every development within the ministry, we had to learn new things, and we had to take on new projects. We had to read, study, take some courses, even take on some personal challenges of learning to do and operate in different ways. And that's been one of the great blessings, and also one of the great challenges of being in one place for a long time. But what it has done for us is given us the opportunity to really get to know people, and we've the people that started with us in those early days, they've had their children, and their children have grown up and had their children, and now those children are having their children, and we've had the opportunity to minister to each of these generations, and just it's been a wonderful experience for us, and we're so appreciative to the Lord, and we're also appreciative to this congregation that has been willing, to allow us that privilege. And we can never express the level of our gratitude, both to the Lord and to the church, for this opportunity. Now, Pastor Skelly had asked me, why Fredericksburg? Why did we end up there? And that story really begins with the story of my own life. And I grew up in Northwest Texas, Amarillo, and I was the number 4 child of a family of 6 boys. And we had a wonderful family. My mom and dad were good Christians, and they loved the Lord. They we were not in a church that was great about any deep Bible teaching, but they were a church that cared, and they were a church that was interested in the souls of men, and they were very evangelistic. And so I, in those early days of childhood, I was exposed to my mother and reading the Bible to us, reading all kinds of things to us. She read to her kids. And I think that had an influence on our lives. And she helped us to memorize Scripture. I can remember memorizing the Lord's Prayer and the 23rd Psalm and things like that. And we would have to quote these when the pastor would come over for dinner. And which we really enjoyed. As a matter of fact, the pastor was a really important part of our life and our family. But as I grew and was subject to Sunday school and also to our table conversation, the Bible and history, were the great topics around our dinner table. And my dad knew a lot about history, and they knew a little bit about the Bible, and enough to really pique my curiosity, and it was something I wanted to know more about even as a young child. When I was 7, then I can remember, beginning to ask my mother questions. She always, fried chicken on Sundays for our Sunday dinner. And there's nothing that draws you boys to the kitchen like chicken frying. And I can remember standing and talking with her and asking her, if based on our Sunday school lesson that Jesus died for our sin, but that he was not a sinner, and that sin was because of death. And I wouldn't have put it in exactly these words, I'm sure, at 7 years old. But my question to her was, if Jesus was perfect, then why did he die? Why the crucifixion? And she explained to me, that we're sinners and that Christ took our sin and that he died in our place on the cross. And that made sense to me. I understood that, as a child. And I can remember on a Sunday morning, as a matter of fact, I looked it up in the church records years later, but it was on December the 23rd in 1955. And I was 56, that is. I was 7 years old, 2nd grade, and this would have been the Sunday before Christmas. I don't remember what the sermon was, but I do remember that it was in the Christmas season, and if it was the Christmas season, then obviously this was a Christmas message. And I responded to the invitation and trusted Christ as my Savior. And just a few days later, as a matter of fact, just about 4 days later, 2 days after Christmas, and I went into the hospital for my first eye surgery. I started having trouble with my right eye when I was 7, and had 2 operations at that point that were unsuccessful, and I lost the side of my right eye. But in that time, God really worked in my life. As a matter of fact, I can remember, this was just a few days after my salvation, I can remember, asking my mom to pray with me, and we're in the elevator on the way to surgery. I was so afraid, and God used those circumstances to help me learn to pray and to trust Him, to turn to Him. And while in the hospital, in those days, the surgery for detached retina, and that ran in my family. And matter of fact, my dad had lost his sight to detached retinas about 3 years earlier. And so I was afraid. And when the surgeries in those days were archaic in comparison to what they do today in response to this particular situation. But they put you in a bed, put sandbags against your head, and you were there for 2 to 3 weeks. You did not move. You were on your back for that time. And that is extremely difficult, let me tell you, for a little boy. And during that time, my mom, tried to pass the time by reading to me. In the beginning, she read some children's stories, and they were short. They were interesting. I could still remember a couple. But when she ran out of reading material, then she went to the Bible. And she began with 1 Samuel. Everybody likes to go to David and Goliath when it comes to kids. And so she started there, read the entire book, and then through 2 Samuel. And with that, I really fell in love with the story of the Bible. The Bible became real. It was full of all kinds of exciting things, and I enjoyed it very much. The David and Goliath, obviously, then the creepy cave, where David hides from Saul, and right on through all the battles and there's some very interesting situations in 1 and 2 Samuel, But I learned to love the Bible, just to enjoy the Bible. I wanted to read the Bible and understand it. Now, over the next couple of years, I followed the Lord in baptism, and as a matter of fact, it was during my hospital days that the pastor would come and visit with me, and he would read the Bible, and he would pray with me. And I can remember thinking, this is what God has for me. That God wants me to do this. And I would not have put that in the terms of a call to preach at that time, but that's exactly what God was doing. Just as we had God speaking to Samuel in the early chapters of 1 Samuel, then God was speaking to me, and it was a pastor's care that was my first inclination toward ministry. And then, of course, over the next couple of years, then I began to understand that. As a matter of fact, I surrendered my life to preach and to pastor. And then when I was 9, in the 4th grade, I started having trouble with my left eye. And I was back in the hospital for a couple of surgeries. And during that spring, after the first surgery, and that was successful at first, and then over a period of time, then the retina began to detach again. And I can remember standing on the front porch of our home in Texas. Across the street was a beautiful park, and my mom had a trellis of rose bushes, and I can remember standing on the porch and looking through the trellis of roses, and they were in bloom at that particular time, and watching the sun go down. When I first was out there that evening, there were kids playing softball in the park across the street. You hear all the chanting and all the cheering and the excitement. And I love softball. This was something that as a matter of fact, I was on a softball team for the first time that year. That was one of the great disappointments to me. Never really got to play the first game. We'd just been through the practice sessions. But I looked through the roses and watched the sun go down, and I watched until it was completely gone. And let me tell you, there's nothing like a West Texas sunset. The reds and the golds and the orange is just the most beautiful thing you can expect. It takes dust to make a good sunset, and West Texas had plenty of dust. But that was the last thing that I remember. And matter of fact, I lost my sight at this point, and by the time of the second surgery was not successful at all. And by the time I was 10 years old that summer, I was blind. And I remember the sitting with my mother, and the doctor in tears was telling her that they had done all that they could do, and that I would be blind. And my mother was very upset with this. But to be honest, for myself, it was a relief, because I'd been through all the surgeries, all the hospital stays, all the time, flat on my back. And I was just, glad for it to be over. I was much too young to understand all the significance, the difficulties that would present in life. But the Lord really gave me a peace. And if there was a time for this to happen in my life, then that really was a good time, because I had 10 years of learning to read and write and to see what the world was like. And I was very curious, and so I have lots of vivid memories of those years. And I loved picture books. I was not a good reader. And so I loved the books that had all the pictures, and I can remember studying the pictures in the hallways of the national parks. And one particularly I remember was of Old Faithful. But so I have a lot of visual memories. But it was young enough. I was young enough that I went through school. The next year, I went to a class to learn Braille and typing and alternative techniques, and then back into regular public school classes. But I was young enough that I used Braille. Most people will never really become proficient in Braille. If you lose your sight as an adult, then that usually just doesn't happen because you are not forced to use it enough each day to become proficient. But for me, starting at 10 years old and going through school, lots of school, then that became second nature to me, and Braille has been a tremendous help to me in my life and ministry. But during this time, God was really working in my life, and a Sunday school class, bought a Braille Bible for me, and I was so interested in getting that Bible. And matter of fact, I didn't really read well until I learned Braille. Print was always hard for me. I was very nearsighted. But when I got into Braille, then I became a voracious reader. And one of the first things I wanted to do was to read the Bible. I read Revelation, scared me to death. Went to our pastor, and he really could not answer my questions. And as a matter of fact, as a result, over the next few years, we looked at other churches that were more serious about the study of the Bible. Ended up in a good independent Baptist church there in Amarillo, Texas. That was a tremendous blessing to me. But God used all of those things, to shape my life. Now, when we got into the church, that we moved into that church when I was in the 7th grade, and when the pastor heard that I'd been called to preach and that I had dedicated my life to Christian service, then he took me under wing, and he expected if you're called to preach, then you need to begin to work toward that goal. And he was a tremendous help to me. And he would take me with him on visitation. Then later on revival meetings, when he was traveling, I would travel with him. And he taught me to memorize Scripture. I was very reserved as a young person, and I was thinking of me as being the preacher would have been a hard thing to put together in those days. But he helped me and get accustomed to being in front of people, and he gave me opportunities, and he taught me to write sermons, and he taught me to understand the Bible, and I owe so much to him. He was a great help, a great mentor to me, and a great advisor. When I went back to the junior high, to my neighborhood, to go to school, then there was the tug of the world. I was a young teenager, and all of a sudden, my Christianity, my call to preach, was another separator. My blindness already set me apart, made me different, but my commitment to Christ, which at that point had never really been challenged. And now there's the tug of the world, and that for several months as a young teenager, I really wrestled with this, and finally I came to the place where I thought, as a matter of fact, it was the fact that Jesus is coming again, and that this life is short, and that this life should be lived for Him, and that we're going to be accountable to Him someday, and that we're going to serve Him forever, that really framed my decision. And I made a commitment at that time, late one night, in my own bedroom, to that I was going to serve the Lord, come what may, that lock, stock, and barrel, I belonged to Him, and that I was going to serve Him and serve Him faithfully. And even if it meant that there would be some persecution or some teasing or some ostracism by others, that was a price I was willing to pay. Now, let me say that from that time forward, that was my commitment to Christ. But I failed the Lord every single day since that time. I've never lived the perfect life. I've never arrived at the final stage of spiritual maturity. And matter of fact, there are things I've had to learn over and over. But I can say that from that point in my life, that was the direction. That was my purpose. That was my goal. And as through those teenage years, my pastor worked with me, and now I told him, that I wanted to pastor. Now, looking back, he never discouraged me from that, but he I think, looking back at his comments to me and his instructions, his advice, that he wasn't sure, that was the best place for me to fit into the Lord's work. And I can fully understand that, from my standpoint today. The big thing was I was never going to drive, and pastors are about all the work that they do every day. Revolves around being able to move here and there, and that was going to be a problem for me. And so he encouraged me to get a good education. He encouraged me toward evangelism. He encouraged me toward teaching in a Bible college or seminary. And I said, well, the Lord's called me to pastor. And he said, well, professors in seminaries, they often take a little church, and work with that on the weekends. And, looking back, I can see he was thinking that would not be the primary focus of my ministry. Now, he never told me because he was careful never to take away the Lord's prerogatives in determining God's will in a person's life. But that was his advice. Now, I had others that gave me advice. I had teachers that pushed me toward teaching, which I was not interested in at all. As a matter of fact, I was going to be a preacher, and in my mind, there was nothing that teaching and preaching had in common, that they were totally different things. But that advice was given to me by the teachers, and I had a missionary, as a teenager that had a profound impact on my life, and he spent a lot of time with me, and he really made a lot of suggestions that were very helpful to me. But most of the advice that I was given was all contradictory. If you followed one plan, you'd have to follow one course. If you're looking at something else, you're going to go in another direction. And I never could make those decisions. And so basically what I did is I just followed all of the advice. Sometimes, it seemed duplicate. Even in my seminary training, I couldn't decide between the church ministries degree and the pastoral degree because they both seemed so useful and so helpful and so interesting. So I just took them both along the way. I just went summer and winter and took the classes that overlapped and then took the classes that differed, made sure that I worked them in. So I followed the both plans, and actually this was exactly what God had in mind for me. But the burden was always to start a church. Now, when I finished college and I taught school in our home church for a couple of years, taught history and English and Bible, and very much enjoyed that. As a matter of fact, with those first couple of years there, and then my 3 years in seminary, I taught at Tennessee Temple's High School. They had just started that, and so I taught for them for 3 years while I was in seminary. I'd take a class, then teach a class, take a class, and teach a class, and teaching history and Bible. But I learned to fully appreciate Christian education. It had a great burden, for Christian schools. And of course, I'd always had that advice to teach, but I didn't see that as connected. And even when I took the teaching jobs, I saw that as a way of making a living, maybe getting a little experience, but I never saw that as a big part of my life's plan. But it was a big part. God really used that to shape my goals, for the church that we found in the future and the ministries that it would have. And I learned not only to enjoy teaching and appreciate the opportunities that are afforded through Christian schools, but also I learned to work with people, with students and with parents. And that was a huge help to me. And I learned to love teenagers. And I still do. I love their energy. I love the excitement. I love their sense of humor, even their mischief. And that was one of the things that was difficult for me to learn was, to be able to separate what was malicious and what was just youthful exuberance and mischief. But once I basically had that figured out, then I just had a great time with teenagers. And I've always, through the ministry, enjoyed time with our teenagers. And for years, I did the Sunday evening program for our teens before the evening service. And we have a lot of great memories from that. I always worked with our time program, our teen missions trips, worked with those kids and was involved with that. But the point is that those really shaped my ministry, but I never lost the burden to pastor. But after I finished college, been through a year teaching, then I thought, well, it's time to start looking at a church. And I went to a couple of churches that my pastor lined up for me that were without a pastor. I was not there to candidate. I was not there as a prospective pastor, but he thought, if I went, they might be interested. But in both cases, they had already, chosen someone else, and I basically was just there as a supply preacher. And but Shirley and I, in traveling and coming home, we thought, that's just not our burden. This is not what we have in mind. And it's hard for me to explain that, but we just realized these were churches that were well established. They were in small communities. They basically were a good place for someone to start or someone to finish up. But as far as the challenge, those areas were small and basically been well evangelized so we weren't interested, and the same was true for the church. They were not interested in us, so it's kind of a mutual decision, but it did focus us toward church planting. And we began to pray about this and dream about this, and this became our passion. We wanted to go someplace where there was genuinely a need, and where we could start a church and we could shape its future and its ministries in the way that we felt that God would lead us, and that hopefully we could spend our life, in that one place. So we said, okay, where do we go? What's the course now? And at that point, I was 21 years old. And I had very little life experience. I'd been preaching for years. As a matter of fact, during my teen years and college years, I was in well over 100 churches. I had youth revivals and supply preaching and different opportunities. And so I'd had that experience, but when it came to life experience and being a pastor and being that comfort and that person that could give advice and help and counsel, that was not me. And I realized that right away, that I was not ready for that responsibility. So we chose to go back to school, and so I went to Temple Baptist Seminary and took my master's and eventually my doctorate. But that and those years were great in preparation, and we got a great education, and the challenges, the people we got to meet, and the young couples we got acquainted with. That was a tremendous time for Shirley and I. Shirley and I married just before my senior year of college, and so we'd been married a couple of years when I went back to school for my to further my education. But those 3 years were great, and during that time, we were looking for an opportunity, and we considered New England, and matter of fact, the particular place we were looking at, then later Jim Townsley, went there. When he finished college, right as we were going to Fredericksburg, he was going to that place. But we never that never worked out for us. But during the time that I was in Chattanooga, my older brother, the brother just older than me, Albert, had moved to, he was a national coordinator, program coordinator for Young Americans for Freedom. And so he was in Washington, D.C., and living in Northern Virginia. He was in Vienna at that time. And he was telling me about all the areas around Washington that were just exploding in growth, and little rural communities that were blossoming into suburban areas, and it was a great place, to start a church. And so, in visiting with him, we would come up when at the holidays when we couldn't get back to Texas, then we would come up to visit with Albert and Donna in Vienna. And we visited their church and talked with their pastor, and he really encouraged us to consider this, and he pointed out a couple of different areas, and we began to talk to other pastors in the area, and the Lord really began to burden us, for the Washington, D.C. suburban area, that is the surrounding areas that were scheduled to grow, and where basically there were no churches, or there was just a little country church that was made up of the family, and that they were not interested in growing because additional members were going to take away the family dynasty that might exist in that church. And so we began to look at different communities. We looked very seriously at Leesburg. As a matter of fact, that was the direction we planned to go. And I studied the town in the encyclopedia and got information from the city, and really was looking in that direction to start a church when we finished seminary. And so when the summer of 1974. I came up to a meeting in July. Now we actually in the summer of '74, when I was finishing up all of my classwork in Tennessee, then we went back to Texas, and there we joined Faith Baptist Church, which was pastored by my good friend, Ron McMullen. He was my dearest high school friend. We were very close, and we were such a help to each other in our own spiritual growth and accountability. And it was he was a great friend, and matter of fact, we attended school together in Tennessee. And then he went home to pastor his home church. And my home church during that time, that the pastor had moved on, and the new leadership, did not know me and was not really interested in being our sending church. And so Ron McMullen and Faith Baptist, where my parents were now members, then they took us under wing and commissioned us, to come to Northern Virginia and to start a church. And so we came in July to a fellowship meeting in Fairfax, and at that point we were introduced to a man, Ron Johnson, who later became a very dear friend, that had just moved to Leesburg and was starting an independent Baptist church. And so we felt like, okay, that's a closed door. That's not where God wants us to go. And we want to go where there's genuinely a need. And so we looked at the other place that we had really considered, and that was Fredericksburg. We went down and visited Fredericksburg, and I talked with Pastor Phillips at Temple Baptist Church over in Stafford. And in those days, Stafford, Fredericksburg, and Spotsylvania were very separate communities. Matter of fact, people did not move from one community to the other to go to church. That would not be true today, and today that even sounds quaint, but at that point that was true. And that pastor said yes, that Fredericksburg area needed a church, and particularly on the Spotsylvania side of Fredericksburg, and he suggested even the Route 3 location. And so we began to look at this and pray about it, and this, God just spoke to our hearts and said, this is the place. And so on my 25th birthday, then I rented a little townhouse in Falmouth, just across the river. We knew that would not be our final destination, but it was available to us then, and it looked like a good place for us to live and to start. And so we rented that. Now Shirley was not with me on that trip. Matter of fact, Stephen, our second son, had been born just a couple of weeks before that on June 23rd. Matter of fact, we were in Texas trying to raise a little bit of support in June, and he wasn't due until the middle of July, and so we felt safe in doing that, and we were in churches for a couple of weeks in June, and we came home just in time for Stephen to be born. Matter of fact, he could have been born in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, or Tennessee. But when we, so when I came in June, I'm sorry, July, and my brother and sister-in-law, they helped me get around to the different places. We finally rented a place there in Falmouth, and then I went back home, finished some summer classes that I was taking, and then we went back to Texas, tried to raise a little more support, when I finished my summer classes, then my brother Alan, who had in the meantime moved to Manassas, then he helped load up our truck, and then Shirley and the boys went with my parents, back to Texas, and then Alan and I, took the truck up to Fredericksburg and moved our. Matter of fact, on August the 9th, it was our travel day, and we sat in the truck going through Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, Virginia, listening to Nixon as he made his resignation farewell speech. If that's the time period in which we were making our move. So we unloaded our things in the townhouse, and then I was in a few churches in Northern Virginia, and then I went back to Texas, raised a little more support. We raised about $300 support monthly. It was about 12 churches helped us, everything from $10 a month to $25 a month. Our home church did a little more. And so we then came back to Fredericksburg, and Shirley, actually came to Fredericksburg for the very first time in about the 11th or 12th of September, and so we rented the place in July. We moved our goods in August, and then we were there to stay in September. And we had been advised to start with the Bible study on a weeknight, and kind of slowly get into this. And then when we had a crowd, a good group, then to start Sunday morning services, and then to work toward organizing the church. But in our own minds and hearts at that point, matter of fact, we'd on our first Sunday in town, that would have been September the 15th. We looked for a church, and we went to the services, and we sat through Sunday school and through the morning service. We were in and out, and not a single person spoke to us. And this was a huge lesson to us. We had considered, this is a place where we might be able to send new converts until we actually got started. We thought, no, this is not the place for us to do that. And so that afternoon, we had gone out to my brothers, Albert and Alan, had bought some property in Morrisville. And they were out there, clearing some land and so forth. They had planned to build in that area in the future. So we went out and spent some time with them. And then we got in the car and we were headed back to church for Sunday evening. And on the road we thought, we're here to start a church. Let's just start the church. And so we drove back, and we sat on a log by campfire, and with my brothers and their families, and Shirley and I and our boys, and we had our first service. It was spontaneous, but it was the first service on Sunday evening. Then the next week, we had our first official service on Sunday morning, and we had been visiting in our neighborhood and contacting people that others had suggested to us. And so on that first Sunday morning meeting, we met in our townhouse, and we had 17 people, and about 4 or 5 families. We had one family there from the townhouse subdivision, and a young lady that had come from the community that had been a part of another church plant that had failed earlier, and they had passed her name to us. And then so we started. We had that photo, and everybody's in it except for my brother Albert, who was taking the picture, and the young lady who had already been picked up by her parents. But so we started, and then we had Thursday night Bible study so that I could make an attempt to raise a little additional support on Wednesday evenings, although that didn't last long because once we were in place, that we did not find it effective in raising additional support. So we were started. As a matter of fact, I put an ad in the newspaper, and I learned a big lesson in this. I called the newspaper and said, that we wanted to run an ad, that I just dictated over the phone. I don't have that here, but I do remember that I wanted to use the slogan, that this is a young church with an age-old message. And then I gave the topic of my sermon for the next Sunday morning, and then the Bible study for Thursday night. And the Bible study for Thursday night was a study in Revelation. Well, when it came out in the newspaper, it was a young church with an old age message, which is not what I wanted to say. And it was a study in revolution, which is not what I wanted to say. So I learned then that you actually type it out and you take it to the newspaper and you make sure that it's been proofed. But they did print the next one for free since they got it wrong. But and so we were on our way, and we started visiting in our neighborhood, our townhouse subdivision, which mainly was young couples, most of them with very young children, and that was a fruitful ministry. As a matter of fact, we had several young couples saved, and they would come to the townhouse and on Sunday mornings, and we had our services. And matter of fact, we had two classes. We had all the children, which were all 9 years old and younger, and all the way down to the nursery. Shirley had them, and then I had the adults. And the adults, pretty much, we could handle at the dining room table. We could sit down with our Bible, and I loved that time. That was a precious time. As a matter of fact, let me say that every period in a church's history has its own blessings, and is that every step along the way, has its own atmosphere, its own blessings, and as those things change, we leave some things behind, but we also get some new things. So we won these young couples, to the Lord, but that was our start right there in the townhouse in September of 1974.
Thank you for taking the time tonight to listen to just a bit of our story. Obviously, this was just installment number 1, but already I think you can see the wonderful, rich story of people just like you and me, getting saved, following Christ, investing their time and life in a place that we call Faith Baptist Church. Thanks for being a part. I love each one of you. I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday. God bless.